of weeks back in our work chat, Nikki dropped in a comment about how it was time for another FUD-busting episode because a post had popped up from Daily Dot called, quote, "I will never buy an EV. Tesla driver shares what electric bill is after installing EV charging station at home." It was a response to a TikTok video about a new Tesla owner's experience of EV ownership and charging. A glance at the article suggested that she was really unhappy with the cost of energy to charge her EV, despite having solar panels to offset the cost even more than for many folks. But when I actually sat down to read the article, it turns out that the editor had made the decision to title the article incredibly misleadingly. "I will never buy an EV" was a comment from some random commenter who made a reply to the video and had nothing to do with the video author, who generally seems very happy with their purchase and the enormous savings they've made. So what gives? Why is mainstream media still obsessed with misrepresenting the EV experience? Look, I have a little card which says journalist. And I have a nice shiny membership of the relevant press association because, well, I am a journalist. And unlike many EV YouTube channels, we aren't influencers and aren't sponsored by automakers, and we try and be impartial and fair in our judgments. We are news with a side of entertainment, not entertainment with a side of news. Although, as I'm sure some of our vociferous haters will comment in the section below, some people consider us neither. Those are, by the way, the same people who generally consider that we are not, in fact, people. So frankly, they can get stuffed. Despite that division of us as a news reviews media outlet, here I am going to be slightly critical of some of my colleagues. And I'm sure some folks will be in the comments doing their best, "Yet you participate in society" meme. And look, we've just endured an incredibly rough election with some truly atrocious reporting from mainstream media and are now living with the result of that. So I get it. You all don't know who to trust. Of course, we have some very fun lists of people who you shouldn't trust, but sharing them here might make us very unpopular, as opposed to the deeply unpopular that we currently are. But one thing that's been consistent from the beginning of this EV revolution, and indeed since the beginning of the battle between EVs and the far more polluting gasoline vehicle, is that the oil industry very much wants to drive the narrative that EVs are inconvenient, expensive, difficult to repair, won't last, are only for the rich, bougie. Reliable, and of course that charging is hugely expensive and a nightmare. And of course, like any lie, it's more effective if it has a little tiny kernel of truth to it. So EVs are currently more expensive to purchase than gasoline vehicles, for the most part, although Kia's suggestion that it might bring the EV3 to the US would finally help to shift that needle at least a little bit. Although I'm not holding fast to that vehicle coming, because originally the updated Soul EV was going to come to the US and then Kia later decided against it. And the likely phase out of federal EV incentives, along with harder restrictions on vehicle imports from outside the US, except probably with some weird carve out for companies that begin with T and end in Esla, might screw that particular pooch. Of course, allowing import of smaller European market vehicles would also help, remind automakers about price competitiveness, because, competition, markets, all that jazz. But since the incoming government is largely pro-monopoly, well, more accurately pro-whoever's lining their pockets, well, that's also another thing that's become more unlikely. But regardless, the notion that EVs are more expensive leaves out that EVs are much, much cheaper to run and require vastly less maintenance. In one fairly recent example, a study found that over a typical 7-year ownership period, you could well save $7,000 to $11,000. Similarly, when it comes to repair costs, because EVs are still, sadly, less common than gas cars, at least in the United States, spares aren't always available in the way that they are for gas cars, so when something does go wrong that actually needs replacement parts, which is, to be fair, rare, those parts can be slower or more expensive to get hold of. Also, while there are a lot fewer parts to go wrong, the individual bits are rarely available from anyone but OEMs, and they can be more expensive. And shade tree mechanics just don't have the skills to dig in and fix individual parts rather than replacing whole modules. We actually had an experience with this on the channel. Our DP's Chevrolet Volt had what we're almost certain was a $2 or so part fail inside the battery pack, but no one was willing to do that repair, and instead what they wanted to do was replace the entire pack at a cost of thousands of dollars and putting the car out of action for months because the parts were back ordered, and just replacing that part, they just didn't have the skills for that yet. While those skills will come over time, and as EVs become more common, the lack of support for right to repair and consumer rights laws from the incoming administration will likely delay that in the US, because automakers are going to make forest fires while the sun scorches the earth, and they're going to take advantage of the lax regulatory environment to implement as much parts locking to specific vehicles as they can. So expect more commentary about improbably high costs for repair, not just for EVs, but also for gasoline vehicles, and really all appliances. And of course, there'll be the usual disinformation about charging, which, if you are not privileged to have somewhere to plug in at home or at work, can certainly be more expensive. Some members of the TE team lack residential charging because landlords often suck, and while it may be legally possible to get a charger installed, it is often difficult. And because the renter is then often faced with the costs associated with installing a charger that they'll then have to leave behind when they move. Renters are often reliant on public EV charging, which is, shall we say, not cheap. Costs can vary dramatically depending on the prevailing electricity costs where you are, the amount of competition in the particular region, how busy that particular charger is, and the individual supplier. Tesla's own supercharger rates reportedly range from around 10 cents per kilowatt hour up to around 50 cents per kilowatt hour, and obviously some locations still charge by the amount of time you're connected to the charger. Other charging stations can vary equally dramatically. One rapid charger I use costs around 10 cents per kilowatt hour, which is ironically less than what I'm billed at home by my utility. It's currently 11 cents per kilowatt hour. One of the benefits of mainly renewable energy is abundant, cheap energy. And also, I get a bonus if I don't charge when the grid is highly stressed. We are also lucky enough to have solar panels, which knocks down the effective cost per kilowatt hour fairly significantly. But elsewhere, I've seen up to 60 or 70 cents per kilowatt hour. And as a non-Tesla owner charging our rental MG in the UK, Tesla's supercharger was egregiously expensive. But if you can charge at home, the math is so wildly, hilariously bad for gasoline cars that it's unreal. Even that Daily Dot article with the terrible headline acknowledges that in just gasoline costs, the average fossil fuel vehicle is nearly 3 times as expensive per mile driven than the amounts quoted by the owner in the TikTok video that the whiny anti-EV commenter was complaining about that they used for the headline. So given that we know that EVs have sold and continue to sell really, really well in other places, especially when there's assistance to get you nearer to price parity, given that we know that there's no way we're keeping this planet habitable without EVs if we want to keep personal transportation as a thing that we have, and given that the experience of owning an EV is so much better than owning a gasoline car, and believe me, I used to be, and still am, somewhat of a petrol head. I love the smell of two-stroke in the morning. Then why is it the case that mainstream media is still publishing the same relentless deluge of nonsense about how they got into an EV and drove it until it ran out of charge and it turns out there wasn't a charger in the middle of the desert? Or that they tried to tow with a Cybertruck but the tow bar snapped, yanking chunks of aluminium casting off the back of the vehicle? Oh no, that actually is right. Well, I have a theory. Well, it's a multi-part theory, just like the theory of everything, but for stupid articles. See, partly it's that the majority of mainstream media is owned by billionaires with a vested interest in extracting as much value from the planet as they can and directing that into their bank accounts, and they have little interest in anything that might happen after they die. And the other is that media companies are struggling right now. They are strapped for cash, and this may have passed you by, but we've just had elections in multiple countries: the US, Canada, UK, just to name a few. And let me show you this little graph from just before the 2020 election in the US. Yeah, that's ad spending on Facebook by fossil fuel companies, which spiked just prior to the election. I'm gonna leave it up to you to guess which candidate they were hoping for. Research by Influence Map showed that 25,147 adverts came from just 25 oil and gas sector organisations. They were shown more than 431 million times at a cost to the advertisers of just $9,597,376. That's just advertising on Facebook alone. Just take a moment to consider the size of their ad buys elsewhere. On YouTube, you can't escape them, and across the companies that own the news media channels and the companies that own the print news media, their ad buys are a big chunk of change in an industry that's largely been bought by vulture capitalists. Dissing the hand that's feeding you, it's kind of frowned upon. And the same sort of thing is true for pretty much all the disinformation, because we're now in a media environment that's going to be even more supportive to legacy polluting industries. We have not just the financial pressures of the large and generous donations and advertising budgets of the fossil fuel industry, not just that to contend with. Now, based on previous behaviour, we can assume that for the incoming administration, organisations which do not act as a mouthpiece for the new government and its policies will be persona non grata. Thankfully, we're already persona non grata, so we don't need to change our editorial stance. As usual, we're ahead of the curve. So despite, or perhaps even because of Elon's involvement, which, to be blunt, is clearly about advancing his social and economic interests, not about saving the planet, we're probably going to see a massive uptick in the mix of disinformation around EVs, around climate denialism, and frankly destructive efforts to make gathering statistics to show the harm that's being done impossible, or at least very difficult. It's going to be a lot of work, and a lot of a fight. And if you want a livable planet, you're going to have to put in the hours. So, buckle up, Buttercup. The next few years are gonna be a ride. Thanks for joining me today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them below in our Discord chat room, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They are some of the more than 1,500 people who help fund this channel through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and making sure that we can be 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. There's a range of different tiers you can sign up for, from as little as $1 a month, or if you pay yearly, just under $11 a year. A huge welcome to our newest supporters: Steve Abernathy, Mike Nichols, Zach Kane, Philip Atkins, Kat, Rob Thomas, Ryan S. Laura, Jay Allor, Scylla Gonzalez, France G. French, Nicole Huang, oh yeah, Pedro Huget, Darren Valentine, Winifred Galash, John Trindle, Sarah Hendricka Bickerton, Edward Krifka, Stephen Beatty, Jonathan Rees, Mia, Owen Patrick, and Gail Jackson. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your week of fame. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. Address is also down below. And if you're in need of some swag, you'll find our swag store in the down below too. We've got some great content coming up, so make sure you've subscribed on PeerTube or YouTube, and we'll see you soon. We make new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want more, the mighty algorithm thinks you'll like this video, but we think this one is also well worth a look. See you soon, and as always, keep evolving!